To start the video off, I'm installing new one-step Colder spark plugs. Colder step spark plugs are better in applications where you're introducing more boost than the engine's used to, or in this case, any boost since this engine's naturally aspirated from the factory. OEM plugs will often run too hot in high boost scenarios, and that can lead to preignition, meaning the mixture in the cylinder will ignite before the plug is normally supposed to fire, since it's already so hot. This can cause a variety of issues, including melting your pistons, so you should always pay attention to spark plugs when you want to make more power. It's a cheap part that can make your engine run way better. Not sure what happened to the rest of the footage here, but I'm missing the part where I'm gapping the plugs. These spark plugs are iridium, so the electric tip is extremely fragile, and there are only specific gapping tools you must use when working with these. For example, a common cheap tool is the coin style one that you find at your local auto parts stores. You should never use these to gap iridium plugs, as too much stress on the electrode tip from the wedging can just snap it. Instead, you should use a wire loop gauge like I have here to open and close the gap, and then feeler gauges just to check the gap. There are a bunch of videos on YouTube for how to do this. Now, I started working on removing the old plugs and installing these new ones, but then I realized I bought the wrong plugs. Well, I bought the right plugs, but the seller sent me the wrong ones, so they didn't fit. Lucky for me, we worked it out, and I eventually exchanged these for the right plugs, so it all worked out in the end. Once I had the spark plugs installed, I decided to start working on welding the extended 1-inch bung that comes with the Innovate AFR gauge. They recommend installing this taller bung so that the sensor is a little further away from the heat and can last longer. Before the turbo kit, I was running the oxygen sensor that came with the kit initially, and it crapped out after 2 weeks because I wasn't careful during cold starts and would sometimes let the sensor heat up before starting the car. It's actually the complete opposite. Because condensation can build up over longer periods if the car is sitting, during a cold start, that cold water gets shot out the exhaust, so if your sensor is heated up before that, the water can land on the sensor and shock it, and then eventually break it. So since learning about that, I've been starting the car right up, and it's been months now of a properly working sensor, so just pay attention. First, I cut off the original bung on the mid pipe, since you want the wideband sensor to be at least 3 feet away from the turbo in applications that are turboed. Then I test fit it to make sure that what was left wouldn't push the sensor too far up. And while test fitting, I found that the surface was uneven, so I decided to use a metal grinding pad to shave down some of the metal and make it even. And then I used a die grinding bit to take out the old threads from the old bungs so that the sensor could go in without hitting those. Once I was ready, I taped the new bung in place to make some tack welds and welded the whole thing. Keep in mind, I'm using a MIG welder, so the welds aren't pretty, but it'll do the job just fine. The 2 transmission seals got delivered, so I decided to start working on those. I started with the shift shaft seal by removing the shifter linkage parts, and then carefully pulled the seal out using picks and screwdrivers, all while trying not to scratch the metal surfaces that surrounds it. Then I worked on the output shaft seal. To remove the nut on the output shaft, I had to trim down the top of my 36mm socket so it would fit all the way around the nut. And then I tried to use one of my clutch fan tools to prevent the top piece from spinning, but that didn't work out. I ended up using my half-inch pneumatic driver to take the nut off. Though the hacked clutch fan tool was useless while removing the nut, it proved itself useful when I was reinstalling it later. Before reinstalling the transmission, I finished cleaning the shift linkage parts and re-greased them while putting them back on. Next up, we cleaned the transmission to be able to check if the seals had fixed the leaks later on. John and I started working on putting the transmission back together, and while he was preparing under the car, I started taking apart the AC lines to make room for the exhaust manifold. I also took out the water pipe that went from the water pump to the factory overflow tank since I knew it would interfere in its current state. I'll have to modify this pipe later to redirect it to the new tank. To get to this pipe, you just need to take the water pump pulley off, and then there's one screw behind it that holds that pipe. They're all 10mm screws. After getting the transmission back on, we moved on to removing the factory exhaust studs because they're too short for the new manifold. These are hard to take out, but we came up with a neat trick that could save you some time. We essentially tightened two nuts on top of each other to force the top nut to unscrew the stud as well. It's kind of complicated to explain, but it's a really simple process as you can see from the video. To replace these studs, I just ordered some same studs that come on the BMW N54 engines because they're longer, but also because they use a torque stip so you can easily remove them in the future. Once we removed the remaining studs, I didn't have the new studs installed just yet, so we started wrapping the exhaust manifold with the fiberglass/titanium heat wrap. I'm wrapping the exhaust with heat wrap to reduce the heat under the hood when the car is running, since the turbo will be producing a lot of it. There's also another method where you can simply just paint the manifold with a thick heat resistant coating, but it doesn't seem to work as well as the heat shield/wraps, so I didn't do that. Though, it's a much easier task than frickin' wrapping and getting fiberglass all over you in the process of doing so. So I'd probably opt for coating if you're comparing the two, because it'll still reduce the heat quite a bit.
If you thought you were having clearance issues before, now you're adding like 3mm, 2mm to your thickness on each pipe.
Yeah. Between the pipes isn't.
But I just mean like between here and your.
Oh yeah, no, I'm gonna have to pull the engine. I'm gonna drop the transmission on you.
It took me a second to process pull the engine. I was like, wait, what? I thought we weren't doing that.
Actually.
That's right, Bren. Actually, we are going to pull the engine, but I didn't know that at the time. You can tell we both didn't want to pull the engine. It's not the best thing in the world to do, but it made it easier in the long run. So I would plan on pulling the engine, like I said in the second video. forgot to mention that I let the heat wrap soak in water so it's more flexible when applying it. Once you use a heat wrap, it's recommended that you use a high temp silicone coating on top of the wrap as an added protection layer. This isn't the same as the powder coating I was talking about earlier, but it's much thinner and it's meant to be used on these wraps afterwards. Since the manifold had been sitting overnight and was dry, it was time to spray the first coat on while preparing the down pipe to be wrapped and painted as well. I used masking tape to mask off areas I didn't want the paint to end up in. While waiting for the exhaust parts to dry, I started working on drilling the turbo compressor housing to add a barb fitting since these turbos don't come with one from the factory. This will be used to connect to the wastegate so it knows how much boost is being generated. This way it knows when to open and close so that any extra gases get out and you don't run more boost than needed. I'm using a 1/8 NPT drill bit and tap kit from Amazon here. I'll drop the link in the description, but you can always find all the parts I use in the Google Sheet I linked as well. For the barb fitting, it's just a 1/4 inch, which is the same size as the port on the Turbo Smart wastegate. You could see me switch between a few drill bits since the 1/8 bit is kind of big, so I started with a smaller bit just to make a pilot hole so the bigger drill bit won't wander around and ruin the compressor housing. To finish installing the fitting, I use Permatex liquid thread sealant. You'll see me use this quite a bit in the series because the Teflon tape type thread sealant isn't great in applications where you can't afford to have the small bits of tape potentially get sucked into the water or oil. So I just decided to use the liquid kind everywhere since it does a job and it's safe for what I'm using it for. Now it's time to move on to the valve adjustment and valve cover gasket replacement. I started by taking off the coil pack harness and then remove the valve cover bolts. When removing the bolts, there's no need to follow a certain pattern, but when reinstalling it later, we'll need to follow a specific pattern so that it can be tightened evenly on the head. The S54 engine uses shims under the camshaft lobes when pushing the valves and will often decrease in thickness over time from the friction. If you don't perform a valve adjustment, you could run into issues where the valves won't open or close all the way, and this could eventually lead to engine failure, so BMW recommends you do this every 30,000 miles. Now, these shim kits can be pretty expensive, and the Wiseco kit I bought only gives you 3 shims for each size, so if you need more than 3 of the same size, you're kind of screwed, and you have to go spend another $70 for another kit just to get 3 more. Or you can use this trick not a lot of people know about and grab shims from a local KTM motorcycle store since they use the same exact shims. These shims can be purchased at a fraction of the price and you can get individual ones so that you don't have to waste money on sizes you don't need. The valve adjustment procedure itself looks pretty intimidating, but it's very easy to do once you understand it. All you need to do is measure the gap between the cam lobe and the rocker arm to see if they're within spec. If one's out of spec, depending on if it's too tight or too loose, you just measure the shim that's in there already using a micrometer, and then find a shim that's slightly smaller or bigger, and that's it. then measure again, make sure it works, and then move on to the next one. It's important to note that during this procedure, the shims are pretty hard to get to, and you definitely don't want to be dropping these into your block. Otherwise, the job will be much harder than just pulling your valve cover off. I use the Schwaben magnetic tool they made just for this, so you can easily get under the camshaft and pick up the shim without dropping it. So it's a pretty neat tool. I think it was 16 bucks. You should definitely pick that up if you're doing this. Hey guys, this is the end of the video. Thanks so much for watching. I just wanted to say, if you guys have any feedback for the kind of content I'm pushing out, and if you guys are looking to get anything more, or if you want me to add anything or you change anything, let me know down below in the comments, or if you have questions about anything as well. But yeah, if you like the video, go ahead and hit that like button. If you want to see some more, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys later.